Today's episode is about suicide, suicidal ideation. We'll be talking about police brutality as well as colonial violence, too. So, if that's too tender to engage with today, feel free to skip this episode. And if you feel called to stay around, just get comfortable, get grounded as we talk about a really needed conversation, but also a tender one. My name is Carolyn Collado, and welcome to Recovery for the Revolution, where we decondition, decolonize, and get ready for the revolution through recovery as a resistance practice. The biggest thing we could do to prevent suicide would be to dismantle systemic oppression. We will be exploring why that is. How do we currently care for suicide? And what are some of the ways that we could combat suicide and systemic oppression at the end? So you'll want to listen all the way through. More of us are feeling suicidal than we say out loud in this society. A lot of us are struggling to feel like we can exist. Everything is so expensive. People cannot afford things. And so a lot of people, I would say, are more in a state of passive suicidal ideation. The idea of not wanting to exist, wanting to, in the words of censorship on these platforms, of wanting to yeet off the planet, then we feel like we can say out loud. And there's a lot of reason for that, especially reflected in the way that we talk about and care for suicide in this country. And I will be getting more into that later in the episode. This episode has been inspired by the many ways that I have had moments of passive suicidal ideation over my healing journey. And I will be sharing more about that too later in this episode. Carolyn from the editing future here. Before we get too deep in the episode, I want to talk about the difference between passive suicidal ideation and active suicidal ideation. Passive suicidal ideation is more the feeling that I was talking about earlier of not wanting to exist, feeling that no longer existing, no longer living might provide relief, provide space, provide an end to whatever is boggling us down, whatever is having us feel this deeply hopeless. But there's no active plan to move forward on that, no active plan to continue towards ending your life. So support for that might look more like having a conversation with somebody, hearing somebody out. Maybe there's other support that doesn't involve an institution, maybe medication, maybe, different therapies, trauma support, etc. Community support, getting you food and housing and care, etc. And then there's active suicidal ideation, which is, that feeling as well of, okay, I no longer want to live. I don't want to exist anymore. I want to end my life. And more of an active pursuit of that, a plan, thinking about how that would happen and moving towards that. That's more when we're in that active suicidal ideation space. And that's where, your care practitioner, whether, your mental health practitioner may consider more of institutional support and bring that to the table. But again, we'll talk about involuntary institutionalization later in the episode, but this is where that kind of conversation, that kind of direction in terms of institutional support would come up. Probably where there would be more escalation of care, talking with you about how to navigate if that desire comes up, who you would turn to, what kind of support would you get, what are the resources that are available to you if you are in that place and maybe needing more levels of a crisis response. So to set the stage, I want to give a couple facts in terms of suicide around the globe and also here in the US empire. So according to the World Health Organization, more than 720,000 people die around the globe from suicide every year. Suicide is the third leading cause of death around the globe of people aged 15 to 29. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control here in the US empire, states that suicide was the second leading cause of death of folks between ages 10 to 14 and 25 to 34. Last year in the US, we had the highest rates of suicide ever. And shout out for like Imani from Crutches and Spice, who really keeps reiterating this, that over 50,000 people last year in 2023 died from suicide. And notably, the facts that I just cited from the CDC, those are not from 2023. They are from 2022, but they are the most recent facts that I could get my hands on in terms of that granular data around different groups and that have been impacted. Something that I also consider when I look at suicide data is the idea of underreporting. The fact that fewer deaths might be marked as suicide because there's a lot of stigma. There is stigma all over the globe in terms of talking about suicide, in terms of care about suicide. And I believe a lot of it is connected to colonization. Connected further to that, let's talk about what suicide rates look like in like LGBT communities and communities of color. So the Trevor Project, which is a nonprofit that supports LGBT young people who are experiencing like suicidal ideation, they cite a study that LGBT young people are more than 4 times as likely as their straight peers to attempt suicide. The Trevor Project says that more than 1.8 million LGBTQ young people seriously consider suicide every year, and at least one attempts suicide every 45 seconds. The Trevor Project has a big national survey on mental health of LGBTQ young people, and so they found that 41% of LGBTQ young people seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, including roughly half of transgender and non-binary youth. Native, indigenous, two-spirit, and like queer non-binary folks have the highest rates of attempting suicide. Overall, the rates among people of color are higher than their white peers and the highest among native and indigenous youth. When I look at this data, it all makes sense to me as somebody who's queer and non-binary and like Afro-indigenous. It makes such sense because it really points to the intersection of colonization, patriarchy, and capitalism. Many of us who have been most impacted by colonization all over the globe, the places that we come from, the communities that we come from tend to be more homophobic, transphobic. Because even though for so many of us, there were notions of gender beyond the binary and sexuality beyond being, heterosexual in terms of like, this is man, this is woman, and that's all that's allowed in terms of like sexual relationships. Many of us had more expansive notions, but colonization reinforced through violence that we had to accept this binary gender and that we had to accept binary sexuality in the confines of marriage, especially, thinking about Christianity and everything. One of the ways that we see this is through the concept of buck breaking. So this happened a lot in the Caribbean where colonizers would SA young Black men to try to break their spirits, to get them to surrender to the colonizer. And so when we think about Jamaica, which experienced this buck breaking, Jamaica has such like violent repercussions and such a strong resistance to queerness because of this, because of the result of that. There will be so much conversation about like, oh, all these places all over the globe, they're like so homophobic, like you can't be free. Oh, we're so progressive in these imperialist colonial nations, colonizer nations. And it's like so much of that comes from this colonial wound. And so we see that, right? We see that reflected in the data of queer and trans, two-spirit, people of color experiencing higher rates of attempting suicide. There's also the intersection with capitalism because so many of us are more impacted in terms of like access to work and respectability. If we don't fit into white, cis, heterosexual norms, it can be harder to keep a job. It can be harder to get a job because every day you're being squished into trying to not be who you are or trying to present a form of yourself that's like palatable and great. It's just harder to survive when you have these multiple intersectional identities and the colonial grief that comes with it. Thinking about Indigenous folks being stripped of access to indigenous practices, stripped of access to ancestral lands, and being extorted by the government and not being given resource, not being given the support needed, and instead being extracted from in a colonial nation that barely acknowledges your existence. Being queer, trans, people of color, like we are coming up in a society that has demonized who we are. A religion, thinking about Christian supremacy all over the world because of colonization, demonizing us and telling us that who we are is wrong. And so there's this rejection from our cultures, our communities, our families potentially growing up, being bullied, right, for who we are. Sometimes our bullies, clocking our queerness, clocking our transness before we even know that ourselves to ourselves. And just the grief of that, and on top of whatever else might be going on in our families, our homes, on top of anti-blackness, on top of racism. I think a song and video that really like exemplifies this is like Lil Nas X's album Montero talks a lot about the themes of suicide. And in the song Sun Goes Down, he talks about worrying growing up, like, are his lips too big? Is his skin too dark? And we see that, right? Like all of the intersectional identities coming together and making things even harder, making belonging and desirability and feeling wanted and loved and cared for feeling even less accessible because of all of those things. And so there's just like big grief from that, big pain from that, that might make us feel like we're hopeless and alone. It's interesting because what also reflects in the suicide data is that suicide rates are also higher among white men. White men are much more likely to like actually carry through with suicide than any other group. And a lot of studies show that that can be connected to patriarchy. That can be connected with upholding the ideals of patriarchy, right? Patriarchy, the idea of everybody is told how they're supposed to be. We're all trying to be closest to the white man ideal. And that ideal means having no feelings, processing no feelings, being tough, being hard, being a provider, and being in a way that is separate from your humanity, right? Like being complacent in racism, being complacent in everything, lacking community, lacking access to practices that support your well-being. And there's a high correlation in terms of it being more prevalent in rural environments. And so, people having less support, less mental health care, and being brought up with these patriarchal norms about how to be. And then it's like, well, if there's a problem, like, let's take this way out. And so it speaks all the way around how toxic, how harmful colonial patriarchy has been to those of us who were directly colonized and experienced colonization, to those who have been complacent in being agents of colonization, of trying to uphold the norms of colonization that all of us are harmed by. So, the other systemic force that all of this points to, again, is capitalism. Capitalism in the ways that so many of us can't afford to exist. I think about the term cost of living, and I think about how horribly capitalistic that is. The cost of living, because under this system we have to pay to exist. So you better go up and make money for some billionaires to get even richer. You better go exploit your body. You better not choose what you would feel passionate about doing and instead go and make what's profitable. You better not care for your body. If you're disabled, if you're sick, forget it. You can't keep up with this pace. Like, you're out of here. You are disposable. And so that's the system we live in, right? Where we like can't even enjoy living, where most of our hours in our day, in our lives, go to making other people wealthy and exploiting ourselves for the wealth of others just so we can keep a roof over our head and food in our bellies and like try to have a semblance of pleasure in our lives. But yeah, a lot of us can't afford to live right now. And so a lot of us feel more in that hopeless place. And maybe when things start to get overwhelming, maybe that's when we dip into being a bit in that ideation. Capitalism and colonization also by design make us feel lonely because they took a sledgehammer to communal living and they created this paradigm where we like have to work to live, right? And we grind out so much of our lives in order to survive, in order to have pleasure, in order to like care for ourselves and those we care about. And so that creates a lot of loneliness. Then we might be really exhausted. And then there's no time for relationships, right? We might not have time for relationships. We might not have time to do the healing that we want to do in order to be in relationships. There can be intergenerational cycles of loneliness, of struggles in relationships because capitalism and colonization create the conditions where we don't have time to process and heal and feel in order to connect. And, I had a whole episode about that called like These Systems Don't Want You to Feel. So check out that episode. But they make us inherently lonely. They make us feel like we are like not connected. Colonization is so by design not about human connection, right? Like when we think about the design of the US empire, it was about profit. So we think about suburbs, we think about the ways that people are so isolated from each other. And instead it's like this ideal, right? Like this American ideal, you have this like single family home away from everybody. You don't get to connect, you don't get to build community. Everybody is by themselves. And, there's no gathering spaces, or if there are gathering spaces, they have to be around profits. Thinking about malls, thinking about like those communal spaces, like they are always centered around getting money out of you. And that's a grief. That's really isolating. And even in places where there is much more like closer communal living and access, thinking about like my hometown, New York City, there was just a shooting by the NYPD of somebody jumped the turnstile. And, you know, when you don't have it or when you're struggling, that 290 really starts to add up. And in like we depend on public transit to be able to connect, to be able to get get to work, get to access to work, in order to have community and to gather. And so it really starts to add up in terms of the cost of doing that. And instead the NYPD, which has a $5 billion budget, is shooting somebody who can't afford to pay that $2.90, right? And instead criminalizing the fact that these things should be free. We should really be able to easily access each other, and instead punishing us if we can't afford it, and instead making us be isolated if we can't afford to leave our houses, because these systems have made it that we have to grind if we are going to connect. And if not, you better get used to getting isolated, to being isolated from others. This episode has been inspired by my own experiences with ideation. Since I've been on a recovery journey for the past 6, going on 7 years, I have noticed that my moments of ideation, of passive suicidal ideation, come up when I feel overwhelmed by systemic oppression, like when I feel hopeless, thrown against the wall by systemic oppression and capitalism, especially. The first time that I experienced ideation, imagine like I'm, sitting on the phone grieving because I am realizing how much my experience with racism, with struggling around gender, around sexuality, so impacted my life and make me feel like I can't be me, I can't be free, I can't exist. And I'm being told to try to go and face that sober. So I want support. And I'm calling up people in Alcoholics Anonymous, where I started my sobriety journey. And nobody has an answer for me in terms of how do I navigate these oppressive systems while sober. Nobody has an answer for me. One person tells me, like, don't even feel it because it's just going to make you mad. And I'm like, aren't we trying to heal from all of the feelings that have been blocked up so much that they're only coming through now that we've stopped drinking? I'm trying to feel my full humanity. I'm not trying to keep suppressing myself. Like, that is literally harming me. That was the first moment that I felt passive suicidal ideation. And I notice it still whenever I am financially struggling, whenever I think that capitalism, since it feels so ever present, right? It's like every moment the phone is dinging with like, this bill is due. Or, if you are behind on debt, like they will call you every single day. They will email you every single day asking for their money. And it's a lot. It's overwhelming. And then we have this made up credit system that determines whether or not we get to have a home, whether or not we get access to like a car, or any other loan that we might need in moments of crisis or in moments of trying to like build and uplift ourselves. So why would we not feel like existence is challenging? Why would we not have these moments of hopelessness? And that gets into why a lot of us feel failed by, or like we can't really depend on the suicide care or mental health care in this country. And I will speak to this country specifically because that's the realm that I know. But if you have experiences from your own country, if you're listening outside of the US that you want to share, let me know in the comments. And even if you're in the US, let me know what your experiences have been. This country does not acknowledge in its mental health care, and especially not in its suicide care, how much these systems of oppression impact why we feel like we might not be able to exist anymore and why we might feel like suicide is our only option. They don't acknowledge it because all of the mental health systems, as they are in the mainstream, are designed to do is to keep us going enough, to be a band-aid solution enough that we continue to produce under capitalism, that we continue to be the money making machines, that they're able to juice us out for as long as they could for their gain. The mental health industrial complex, as we call it, right? The mental health system will instead pathologize you and be like, oh, like there must be something else going on, rather than recognizing, like, oh no, like this person can't make their rent. This person is struggling to feed themselves. Like, yeah, that makes sense why they would feel like they can't exist here anymore. Like, that makes absolute sense. Or they don't take into context how race, how gender, how sexuality connect with why we need care and support. They don't do that generally in the mental health, or they don't do it well. That's scary. And a lot of how suicide has been cared for is really centering crisis care. So, how that unfolds is that one, there can be some practitioners who will involuntarily institutionalize you if you share that you are feeling suicidal. So, what that means is, like, without your consent, sending you into an institution, a psych ward, maybe a rehab if you struggle with substances or, eating disorder, etc. They will send you into a treatment facility without your consent. And that can be really traumatizing. It's funny because there's like a whole realm of the internet now. They make light of how terrible our care around suicide and crisis is. So, that institutionalizing that I was just talking about, there will be people on TikTok who call that a grippy sock vacation. Because if you're familiar with those institutions, the folks who are like, who get sent to them, like they give you socks that have grips on it just to like navigate the hospital floor or the institution floor. So people call it taking a grippy sock vacation. So sometimes that's outsized in terms of what people need, because a lot of us, it might just be the level of like, I need rent support, I need care, or I am navigating like a really homophobic environment, work, my family, transphobic, I can't get housing. I'm thinking about the over 500 pieces of LGBTQ two spirit legislation that were passed last year in the US empire. Like that alone might make you feel like you can't exist. Or Roe v. Wade being overturned, and the threat to our bodily autonomy being overturned, and that making people feel like they can't exist. And so a practitioner who might not be skilled enough to recognize, like, okay, let me support this person and feel out where things are, may jump into institutionalizing. So I had an experience where, so I've been recovering from a concussion for 9 months as of recording this. And part of what can happen when you're having concussion, traumatic brain injury, is that there can be mood swings, because your whole, just like your brain, your nervous system are just so deeply impacted. And so early on in my concussion recovery, between March and May of 2024, where there was self-immolation in response to Gaza, where there were many, many attacks on Gaza because of Met Gala, the Super Bowl, like there was so much happening. And then in May, there was all the student protests. I was seeing all of that and I was enraged. Like I was so pissed. And so that was coming out in my concussion care. Like it was impacting me. And the medical team that I was seeing, two of the people who cared for me, really did not know how to handle that. Like they just thought that something was wrong with me. Oh, like, can't you just compartmentalize better? One of them kept checking the psychological, like, emotions test. There's a question that flags around suicidal ideation. And the practitioner said to me, if you told me you were suicidal, I don't know what I don't know what I would do. And I was like, well, well, I am not going to be honest about the passive suicidal ideation that I've been feeling, because I don't need that. I know that I do not need the institution. What I need is somebody to help me to pay my rent, to keep food in my belly while I'm in this period of disability. Like I cannot produce or work, and I need the end to this mass unaliving in Gaza and all over the world. Like I just need an end to this, because how are we supposed to feel hopeful? How are we supposed to feel like we can exist in an empire that is actively harming people abroad? It's being beamed into our phones, and despite most of the country not wanting this, going against our will because of profit, and telling us to our face that they won't listen to us. Like, how are you supposed to feel hope when you see that, right? Well, we feel hope with each other, and I'll get into that more later in the episode. But yeah, you take a wrong turn and you can end up with a practitioner who doesn't actually know anything about mental health, or like really have an understanding, or is bypassing what's happening, or doesn't understand the reality of struggling, of financially being unwell, and the ways that that can impact mental health. And then you could get outsized response to what you actually need. And I do want to name, there are practitioners who definitely can distinguish between when you are in a suicidal ideative space and just need to be really heard out, listened to, but maybe not getting more escalated care than that, than practitioners who may want to point you towards, okay, do we want to consider, going to the psych ward, or like an institution, and practitioners who can talk to you about that and try get consent with you in that way, in terms of what do you want to do, or whether or not they feel like they need to escalate the care accordingly, and they can have lots of conversation with you about that too. But, in that story that I just told, the difference is that I didn't get to pick my care person. Like the care team that I was given to me because I'm on Medicaid. When I do distinguish, that is one of the things that I vet people for. Where do they stand in terms of mandatory reporting? The notion that people like care workers, mental health providers need to mandatorily report anything of harm to self or others, versus folks who recognize that, through conversation, you can discern whether or not there's actual risk of harm or not. So that's something big to look at when you're considering a practitioner. And, there are a lot of practitioners who are building more skills. Shout out to Umu, who does the radical mental health first aid and talks a lot about how do we distinguish between where somebody is in terms of the kind of care that they're needing and how to proceed according to that. And I want to have Umu on the podcast. So, hope to bring them in soon. But there are people who do distinguish. The trouble is that there are also a lot of people who are not equipped with that skill. And so it's really about also learning for ourselves as people who are coming into health settings to see if we can vet out the person and see whether or not they are equipped to really hold where we're at in terms of the kind of support that we're needing. And that's hard because so many of us need mental health support. And in terms of that, like really skilled and, you know, open care that's not so tied to how the system has made mental health practitioners into cops in that way of like mandatory reporting and involuntary escalation into institutions. It's hard. It's hard to find folks. So, give yourself grace if that's been challenging for you in your journey. And I want to reiterate too that there are people who can hold us in all of this and not make us go into things involuntarily. The thing is that sometimes people involve the police in terms of this crisis care. And we saw the really fatal repercussions of that this year with Sonia Macy, a Black woman who called the police because she thought that there was somebody in her house, and the police killed her. And if that doesn't speak loudly to the fact that our current like immediate response is not equipped to support people when they are in moments of fear, of needing support, of maybe where mental health needs support, I don't know what does. So it's loud, and it makes sense. Speaking of those folks on the internet who make light of how grave and under resourced we are in terms of mental health and suicide care, a meme that has stuck in my brain has been this TikTok meme, and I can't find the original version, but it's somebody beatboxing what the suicide hotline sounds like. And it's like, you're suicidal? Why? And it's all about how inefficient, and the comment sections were filled with how inefficient our suicide care lines are in terms of supporting folks. The comment sections were filled with people being like, I don't know if this was their plan, but I ended up not killing myself that day because I was so frustrated by the quality of care that I got on that phone. Like, I was so inefficient. They kept hanging up on me that I just was so frustrated that I just gave up the whole idea and the whole thing. And that's not the care that people should be receiving. And so it's funny because initially when I recorded this episode, I got nervous about critiquing the resources because people need resource. But there is a list of care resources that are warm lines that will not call the cops. And I will be listing them below in the show notes. But one of the links is inclusivetherapist.com/crisis. And these resources from that inclusive therapist link that I talked about have resources for BIPOC folks, like LGBTQ folks and Black femmes, trans folks, trained peer supporters, Native Americans, trans specific hotlines, and LGBT hotlines as well. And then there's don'tcallthepolice.com. You might have local resources that you don't even know who might provide more of that kind of needed immediate support that won't call the police, that might help you get some resource that you need, rather than calling these lines or calling the police and potentially endangering yourself or others around you by police who are not equipped in terms of supporting our care, or practitioners who are not equipped in terms of supporting our care. So I said earlier that the biggest way that we could prevent suicide would be to dismantle systems of oppression. Let's talk about how we do that and also some harm reduction resources to navigate when we are feeling this way, that we can exist and that we are struggling to keep being here. Mutual aid, direct aid is one of the most life saving things that we can do to support people in continuing to be here. In this country and around the globe as well, there's the notion that we contribute to nonprofits, that nonprofits are the best way to support the people who are struggling. But those nonprofits often have a lot of control over who gets access to resource, when, and how. And so funneling that money into them may or may not get help to those who need it most. Instead, sending those funds directly to people is often what will most save people's lives. A lot of nonprofits, in order to get resources, people have sobriety requirements. And that can be hard to maintain when people need the resources that they're trying to get, right? Housing, food, shelter, in order to even have any look at their relationship to substances and whether or not they even want to, right? But instead, there's this sobriety requirement, and that is often so harmful and so inhibiting in people getting the resource that they need. And shout out to Saving Our Own Lives by Shira Hassan. That's a book about harm reduction and community care. Check it out for more on what I'm talking about, as well as The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, which talks all about the nonprofit industrial complex and, the ways that it can harm community. So instead, direct aid. We see how big that's been. If you've been seeing all of the campaigns for sending money to folks in Gaza, that is directly giving those people access to water, food, shelter. Giving directly is life-saving, and we see that. And we see that in the ways that GoFundMe and PayPal are actively trying to shut that down because they want Zionism to continue. If it's not clear how life-saving mutual aid is, I don't know what is. And mutual aid, direct aid, is what has gotten me to enough of a health point this year that I'm talking to you and giving this information, because if I was not given mutual aid and direct aid to heal and get better, I would not be able to talk to you right now. I would be still really struggling to speak anything, speak some sentences, let alone talk about all of this heavy and important conversation. Community care and community involvement. There have been so many times where I have felt hopeless, and community has helped me feel like I can continue to exist. Pleasure in community. So I come up from the drag scene here in DC. And so shout out to Ricky Rose, Molasses, Magic Dyke lives in Kenya now, but Magic Dyke, those three drag kings were so big in terms of just seeing Black and Indigenous two-spirit representation celebrating, shaking their booty on stage. Shout out to Midori Minx here in DC as well, a Black femme burlesque performer who, again, like thickness on screen, like thickness on stage, and just feeling like our bodies could be celebrated. We could celebrate and visibilize our bodies in a way that is so healing to that colonial patriarchy that I was talking about earlier. And so seeing them perform, being part of getting to perform with these folks, has saved my life so many times and opened me up to so much community here, like other liberated, like-minded folks. I think about kink community and how big that's also been for me in terms of healing, in terms of access to pleasure, folks who are committed to pleasure and who are willing to have conversations around community and consent, communication and consent, in order to facilitate and create safe spaces for pleasure for us. So shout out to kink community, shout out to uh, Madam Seduction here in DC, shout out to Mix Eden, shout out to Jax and Eli, folks who have been holding down containers here. Shout out to Sex Down South, a big conference that's held every year in Atlanta and all over the country. We need each other to feel like we can keep going. I want to share a story from One Piece. So spoilers from here if you don't want to know anything about One Piece, but this might also be the thing that gets you watching that 1,000+ episode series. um, it definitely is what got me hooked. So there is the Straw Hat Pirates, right? They are this pirate crew and are trying to get the One Piece, this like big treasure. And along the way, they come into conflict with the world government, an oppressive regime that, comes after pirates. And so this new pirate who has come into their lives, Robin, is heavily wanted by the government, like one of the most wanted people by the government. And she has been since she's been a child. Robin, when we find her, she's like 26, 28. So almost her whole life she's been running. And finally, they go to this one town and Robin is scooped up by the government. And so the Straw Hats try to go and save her. But Robin is just like, just let them take me. Let this be over with. I want to die. And, the crew is horrified. Like, what? Like, that's why. So they still go. Like, they go to this maximum security prison to try to get her out. The peak of this episode is Luffy, the main character, like our main kind of boy that we follow in the show, like asking Robin if she wants to live. The insight that we get in this moment is seeing why Robin has been on the run for so many years. The reason that Robin is so heavily wanted by the government is because she has the ability to read ancient texts from people who were alive before the rise of this oppressive world government. She has access to like the hidden history of this that might threaten that government. So the government, they wiped out the archaeologists that Robin was trained by when she was a child. They killed her mother, who was like a big archaeologist, and they made it so she has this huge bounty, so everywhere she goes she has to run. Nobody can like have relationship with her, or they will be, an accomplice to the government, or they'll sell her out for a lot of money. And so she's always been running, and finally she sees in this crew that maybe she has found the chosen family who is actually equipped and ready to fight the government with her, for her. And there's just a beautiful scene where she's just like crying, and like again Luffy's like, tell me you want to live, and she's like, I want to live, like I want to live, like come and get me. Oh, not me crying as I'm talking about it, but that was the moment that convinced me that I wanted to watch the show. And the payoff has been great ever since. It's a great show in terms of oppression and regimes that are harmful, and how do we find the community to fight back. So we deeply need each other in order to fight back, in order to feel like we can keep going, especially those of us who are resisting these systems. If I didn't have people who were resisting alongside me, I wouldn't be able to be here. I want to give like a couple of harm reduction tips as we think about, okay, how do we continue to be here? One, emo music can be really, really helpful in terms of like expressing emotion. So thinking about Rage Against the Machine, System of a Down. One of my favorite songs is like Famous Last Words by My Chemical Romance, which has this line like, I am not afraid to keep on living. My Chemical Romance came out of like, was inspired by 9/11, so they know all about that imperialism and that struggle of continuing to exist. Paramore has some really great songs about navigating capitalism and like, ain't it fun, or hard times, just like how incredibly challenging it is to exist. Those songs, that music can be so helpful for when we feel like we can't be here. One of my favorite songs that really speaks to these themes is Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen, written by Freddie Mercury, a queer person of color ancestor. And it really does touch on these themes of suicidality, of, you know, like not wanting to die, but also, I sometimes wish I'd never been born at all. And just how much and how challenging it can feel like to exist. And All of that resonating in such like a beautiful song. And ultimately, again, he says at the end, like, nothing really matters. Anyone can see. Another piece of media that really exemplifies this struggle is Everything Everywhere All at Once, where Joy, a queer Chinese first generation American daughter, is confronting the grief of having a family that doesn't respect or honor her queerness. And so much of the movie is about that existential, like, nothing even matters, right? And maybe not even wanting to exist. And so badly, Joy wants her mother to understand that grief and that pain. And I think it's a really great movie about the ways that our experiences as queer people of color, as first generation Americans, because, I think about studies that I did back in high school around how first generation Latinas were more likely to attempt suicide than their peers. And so much of that was because of that experience of, you come to this country and suddenly you have to perform the norms of like white supremacy. Your family doesn't get it, and you have to try to achieve to lift your family out of their socioeconomic situation. And how painful that is, and ultimately, does it mean anything in the wake of all of the suffering that it causes to try to do all of that, in the face of the racism, in the face of the queerness, in the face of the patriarchy that we experience and the white supremacy that we experience here in this country? Does it all mean anything at the end of the day? And so I think that movie really exemplifies how all of those intersectional identities can bring us to this realization sooner and this feeling of hopelessness sooner than those who may not hold the same intersectional identities. Our ancestral music can help invoke joy that our ancestors have been leaning on for a long time. My grandfather loved singing, and singing is also one of the big ways that I soothe my nervous system. But nothing kind of brings me out of a funk more than bachata, merengue, salsa, the genres that have been like alive in the Caribbean for generations that my ancestors also enjoyed. My ancestors also turned to in order to keep living. So sometimes that good classic music can help us feel like we can keep being here. Thinking about Celia Cruz and like Kimbara, like these songs that just like invoke the ancestors, they can help us keep being here. Giving yourself space to scream and shout and let out what we're feeling. We are so told that there is like no safe space to do that, right? And, we might not want to in like the ways that we grew up with. We might have grown up in homes where people were screaming and shouting and throwing things. And so take this as it resonates for you, but maybe finding a safe way to have outlets to scream, maybe screaming in a pillow, or maybe there's a kind of secluded spot that would feel safe and comfortable to scream in, to shout in, might be helpful. Breaking things or throwing things in ways that feel accessible. I've definitely gone to rage rooms. That can feel so nice. Just like playing some, again, for me, it's the emo music because I am an emo kid. But, maybe putting on, I've also done it to trap music too, like music that just feels good and you just throw stuff and break stuff. That might feel good. Or if there's a space that feels accessible and where you won't be policed to go and do that, maybe that's a safe option too. I've also done it in my home where I've thrown just like Tupperware so that way nothing breaks. But, it's the sensation of being able to throw stuff, the satisfaction of watching things like go across the room. That might be good. So if you have like takeout Tupperware or anything, that might be good, like a good way to have that release in a way that's kind of contained. Finding your harm reduction practices. So TV is really big, whether that's anime or reality TV has become like so big for me since the concussion. Reality TV, movies might help you get absorbed into a world for a while. All of that might help you like continue to live. Playing video games. I think about Baldur's Gate 3 and when I was feeling so hopeless and alone over the winter, and romancing Karlach, romancing Astarion in the game. If you know, you know, helping me feel like life was worth living and that I wasn't alone, you know? Potentially plant medicine that might help with pain that you experience ongoing. It might help in terms of accessing healing, or maybe it's looking at your relationship to substances and seeing like, is there ways that this is like harming me? Are there ways that I might want to step back and mitigate or stop altogether? Whatever is accessible for you. Again, leaning on ancestral strength, because I noticed that I sometimes, again, I told you about how I can get into that space where capitalism feels all consuming and I feel like I can't exist, like I should just stop existing. And sometimes like the way that I get refuge is going to nature, going to the creek, speaking to ancestral spirits, speaking to my ancestors directly, and even just invoking just overall the energy of like collective justice, of decolonization, and calling it in to help me fight back, right? Like calling on these ancestors, deities, overall, just the belief that these systems will come to their justice. That helps me to fight back and that helps me to keep going. Leaning on friends, calling up people, all of that can be so helpful. And then what I said around dismantling these systems. So there is the way that our existence can be resistance, right? Audre Lorde and the idea of, you know, self-preservation being an act of political warfare, like caring for ourselves being not indulgent. I kind of mixed around that quote, but you can look it up. You know what I'm saying if you've heard it before. When we care for ourselves, we can stick around another day to also dismantle these systems. Even just our own existence can help dismantle these systems because we also show people that we can exist. Here I am on this episode, a queer, non binary person who has been around for a couple of decades, who has kept being here enough to share this information with you, and whose people in their life, in my life, have made it possible for me to keep being because they existed. Shout out to my sponsor, Ray, a harm reductionist. Like, just so much in terms of like, okay, how do we just keep being? And how do we keep being when like our brains are telling us that like we can't be here? Ray taught me a lot about this in terms of just sometimes our brains are just trying to like do a thing and are really attacking us on a given day. And so how do we just be gentle with it? How do we let the day kind of pass or the next day kind of pass until we might feel better enough to be here? There's a TikTok that's like, call out of work, get your controller, play the games, get some dopamine, let Uber Eats rob you, and then try again tomorrow, you know? And it can very much be that in those moments of ideation, sometimes it's just like, okay, I am not feeling well today. My brain, my little brain is trying to protect me, but the way that it's doing so is like, you know, harming me in this moment. So, how can I go be gentle with myself today and see if tomorrow things might feel a little better, or maybe the next day? And then from there, seeing if there's extra support that we might need, right? Whether it's like mental health support, therapy, maybe medication, plant medicine, etc., etc. Dismantling these systems can look like speaking truth to power and being in action. I spoke earlier about the boycotts, right? Like boycotting industries that have been supporting Is Not Real is having an active impact, where Is Not Real's economy is in shambles. Like Is Not Real probably won't be able to exist because they're like economically they are not supported by the globe at the moment, even though the US empire keeps funding them and funding them with our tax dollars. Most of the world has turned their back on Is Not Real, and so will they continue to exist? Probably not. So there is an effect, there is a power. There is a power in gathering as communities so we can resist, so we can stop depending on capitalism so much and instead depend on each other. And another way that we dismantle systemic oppression is growing our capacity to support people in their healing and well being, and especially in a way that centers liberation from these systems. Because, like we talked about before, there are so many ways in which, when practitioners are really ill equipped, when they bypass the impact of systemic oppression, when because of regulation and the ways that the system sets up mental health practitioners to act as cops and to report people when they are in states of needing support and care, and when they feel like they don't want to or cannot exist under these systems in this life, we need folks who can support us in healing from that, support us in healing our nervous systems, our bodies, and in a way that fully recognizes how all of the things that we are experiencing, all of the ways that we navigate being human beings in bodies that need food and shelter and housing and care and food that can so greatly impact how we feel and our well-being. When we have folks who can recognize that, that's huge. And a lot of that also looks like it's not strictly within the confines of the mental health industrial complex. So meaning that it doesn't all have to come from our therapists, our psychologists, psychiatrists. A lot of that can also come from building up skills within our own communities in terms of how do we support our people? How do we grow capacity within our relationships to hold folks, to be able to listen when folks are going through it, to support them? Peer support containers can be so important in this, spaces where there's ongoing community so people can build connection and share vulnerably and be supported is so essential. And again, in a way that explicitly decenters the police, does not center police, instead centers our care and well-being, and recognizing what all of that looks like within the whole person and within these oppressive systems. So it's really important that we build the skills to care for each other in a way that is whole and thinks about everything, including these systems. There is the work of deconditioning. One of the deep commitments of this podcast is to support us in deconditioning so we can imagine more for ourselves than beyond what these systems told us is possible. So, learning about what life was like before colonization, learning about what land back, the rematriation of the planet to indigenous stewardship so that we are no longer in these systems where we are in an extractive relationship with this planet and we feel like we're separate from nature. And instead, we care for nature and nature cares for us because we are all part of it. We are nature. And we deserve to be cared for. We do not have to have this cost of living. We all deserve to be well and cared for. So, beginning to learn about that and beginning to work towards that dream, to resist empire, to resist this place that has caused harm to so many places around the globe. Resisting, learning that history, and wanting and mobilizing for more than ourselves than what this system tells us is possible. So, as you're listening to this, the biggest thing that you can do is to continue to do your best to be here. Because when we are here and we are leaning into our freedom, whatever that looks like, when we are asking for help and receiving help from our communities in order to stay here, when we give ourselves enough space to heal and to imagine more for our lives than the harm that has been experienced in our lives and in the lives of our ancestors, that is how we push back. And that's how we make it possible for more of us to be on this planet. If you liked this episode, I recommend you check out other episodes talking about feeling and healing as resistance, what my recovery story looked like, and give us a subscribe, give us a follow, and check out the next one for more about how those practices can resist these systems.